Look, where do you start? Yeah.
Well, start with the start. I mean, you obviously grew up wanting to be a doctor.
Well, sort of. Okay, so yeah, I was born back in 1944 in the middle of the World War, and we lived at a place a bit south of Warramboo, which is well south of Wudinna. But there was a good hospital at Wudinna run by the Bush Church Aid nurses. They had some affiliation, I think, with the Anglican Church, and so they were top class nursing sisters, and they could do pretty well everything. Sometimes Wudinna had a resident doctor, but when I was born there wasn't one because that was 1944, and there was a doctor called Trudinger. If you ever want to make a story about him, be prepared.
I do.
He lived at Elliston. He was the doctor there.
Yes.
And would regularly come to Wudinna to deliver babies and to do surgery and so on. And he would have driven, goodness knows, probably hundreds of thousands of miles to and fro.
Yep.
The Bush Church Aid people that policed those country hospitals, those nursing sisters were absolutely amazing. But apparently I was a bit too comfortable and a bit reluctant to move out, so they whistled up Dr. Trudinger, Trudy that they called him.
Yeah. And
he came up, and apparently I just needed to be turned or jiggled with or something, and that was that.
Easy if you know how.
If you know how, that, yeah. Yeah, so, and at that time we were living on a farm south of Warramboo, which is also south of Wudinna. You know the west coast a bit. Yeah, and we had, they called it correspondence lessons. They'd call it distance learning these days. And my older brother, Alan, he's 3 years older than me. So he did up to, grade 5 at that, and I did grade 1. And then a family decided that when the area school opened at Wudinna, they thought, look, yeah, we probably had potential to go beyond grade 7, so they chose to buy a farm within reach of the school. We were still 12 miles away, but there was good school bus connection. So I started at Wudinna School in 1950 when I was in grade 2, and went up, did 10 years of schooling there up to completing intermediate certificate, which was as far as the school went then, and got fairly good marks and was able to win a Commonwealth scholarship. And they were, probably still are, amazing because they would pay your school fees, and if you lived in the country or somewhere a little bit away from easy access to the school, you got quite a substantial living allowance, boarding allowance as well. So I think the family might have made it possible for me to come to school in Adelaide to do year 11 and 12 anyway, but thanks to the scholarship it made it a whole lot easier. So,
which is what they're there for.
Yeah.
Helping bright kids, grab the opportunities.
And, you know, a number of the other people in my class, different ones became teachers and all sorts of other, people who contributed to society.
Did that come with a commitment to work in regional areas when you qualified?
No. It was simply, that you could do your matriculation, which was leaving year 11 at that stage, or if you wanted to go on to uni, then it was advisable to do year 12. Yes. And because I was young for my class, I was about a year younger than most of them, they probably sent me to school because I couldn't shut up.
Well, you obviously had a great thirst for knowledge, and you've never...
Yeah. And there were always books around at home, and my parents, they never had the chance to go to high school. Mum would have loved to have trained as a teacher. She was quite a good natural teacher. Dad would have loved to have trained as a doctor. He was also a good teacher. They both would explain not only what you should do, but why you should do it, and why you should do it in a certain way, so that it would turn out the best for you and the best for whatever you were doing. So,
which is very enlightened. That was just them, or I mean, they were...
it was them, and I think the attitude of their families around them too.
They were... Whereabouts, what was their sort of background?
Yeah, my dad's family, they initially came from the Barossa area, and my grandfather's brother moved over to the West Coast, as it was called then, in the early 1920s. And then he said to my grandfather, his younger brother, look, they're giving away land. And they were. They'd give away land with the proviso that you lived on it. And being younger children in big families, there was not really a hope of them buying land in the Barossa or the lower mid-north or wherever. So all this new country was being opened up, and my grandfather's brother, I think Klante, I think that was his name, he was already at Wudinna, and he said, you know, come on over, Gus. Grandfather Gus, yeah. And so they went there, and then they were offered this land south of Warramboo on the proviso that I lived on it. So it was just scrub, mallee scrub and some pine trees and stuff. No surface water of any kind. And the first year they pitched a tent literally under a big tree and built their own home. There was my grandparents and my dad and his older brother. So there were the four of them essentially. And built, you know, the house first house that I remember, they built it out of the native pine wood, which is fairly termite resistant. And it had a packed down dirt floor, and it wasn't lino, it was something called rubberoid. It was a sealed sort of surface. Which
they used to wash with a bit of milk in the water. Make it dark and shiny.
I don't remember them wasting milk on that. It got mopped, and we certainly tracked enough dirt in and out. And there wasn't any real groundwater, and it wasn't a real good place for making dams. There wasn't a lot of runoff, only 12 inches of rain a year, which is not all that much. So one of the big features of my dad's young life was carting water from the railway line at Warramboo, and that would have been something like 8 miles or something away. And because, again, they were so short of water and of feed, they could only have a couple of horses that were more like stock horses. Instead, they had donkeys, teams of donkeys. My grandfather had been up to the goldfields, think of the name of it, northern South Australia, and they used donkeys up there, and he got the idea. So they had donkeys for a while, but of course you need a lot more of them to pull anything.
But that was the introduction of donkeys to that part of our peninsula?
Probably.
Because I believe Mr. Katersky went to the Klantes at Warramboo to get his team of donkeys.
He got some donkeys from there, yes. And I remember a particular donkey, this is later on when I was a small child, a white one that was fairly tame, and he used to pull a cart in it, and we'd sort of, go around in this cart. Yeah, so life wasn't easy, particularly with the water carting. And then the Todd pipeline was brought up from near Port Lincoln, and that made a big difference because then didn't have to cart the water so far, and then eventually actually got it reticulated onto the farm. So, and being able to get fertiliser like superphosphate made a huge difference as well.
Do you remember the difference?
No. But they talked about the difference that it made to actually put that on the soil, because, if you clear new ground, you have fantastic crops for 1 or 2 years, and then because it's essentially sandy, there's not much nutrient left in it, so you need to put some stuff in it that crops like. And because we were about 12 miles from Warramboo, they called it correspondence school in those days. You'd get sent a parcel of stuff I don't know, every fortnight or once a month or something, so many lessons. And so that it was usually my mother that took those. And so you'd sit down and you'd do your lessons under her supervision. I mean, she was probably cooking dinner and looking after the baby brother and all the 25 other things at the time.
How many siblings?
I'm the second one in the family. I have an older brother. Then another brother, Keith, was born. He unfortunately took ill when we were at my grandmother's place. One of Mum's brothers was married, and they decided it'd be nice to have a cute little girl as a flower girl. And there was another little girl of similar age in the family, so we went. First of all, Mum had gone over after her father died, and then there was this wedding, and I was invited to be part of it, so we went and stayed with my grandmother that lived at Pine Creek, near a bit north of Laura on the Pine Creek. And then my little brother took sick and was put into hospital, and he died of gastro, or something like that, which was really shook the family enormously, as you'd expect. And so that was when they began to consider adoption. So I don't know whether there'd been miscarriages or something. I don't know. Anyway, so Barry came into our lives.
Yes.
And then a little later on, they said, look, there's a family, we're very concerned, and there's a little girl who'd fit nicely into your family. So again, my foster sister Margaret joined our family. And then Mum found herself pregnant again with my younger sister Valerie, and then there's a younger sister Helen, who's 11 years younger than I am. So it was a fairly big family.
House was full of love.
And noise and kids and games and
yeah.
But when I was 6, we moved from the first home I remember at Warramboo. We moved to a farm 12 miles west of Wudinna, and that was quite a different sort of home, because it was a proper house, so to speak.
House not made of sticks.
Well, it had 3 sides of it was solid stone and whatever, and a decent roof. The 4th side, they'd obviously planned to extend it out a bit further, so that was simply corrugated iron with lining of some sort. It wasn't bags, it was, I don't know, some sort of panelling kind of stuff.
Pretty fancy though.
Oh, it was a good home for us, and it was unusual because the home had been built as a rectangle with a roof, and then a lean-to part added, and then they'd built a skylight in the middle. So there was this quite a big room in the middle of the house. It would have been about as wide as this and as long as this room is. And so that was where there was a big table, and Mum would be sewing up one end, and Dad and Grandpa and friends would be playing cards up the others, and we'd be doing homework more or less in the middle. And so that was sort of the middle of the house. And
the living room. And
so we finished up.
That was the room that was full of all the noise?
Of course. So you sort of learnt to just get on with it with other things happening around you.
Who was the oldest?
I have a brother, Alan, who's 3 years older than me. Then there's me. Then there's my adopted brother, my brother Keith, who died, my adopted brother Barry, much the same age, my adopted sister Margaret, and then another sister Valerie and another sister Helen. So Alan was 14 when Helen was born. That was sort of quite, I think she might have been a bit of surprise, but
But families were bigger.
Oh, they were, and on a farm you can feed everybody.
Yes.
So it was interesting. We had quite a lot of freedom, in that as long as you turned up for meals, nobody got too worried. But if you weren't there at meal times, then they'd maybe come looking for you. And we were taught, different sort of things. And
well, how far would you range?
Oh, from the house? Oh, if we wanted to, there's about, would have been 100, 200 metres away, there was a granite rock, and we just called it the rock, but I've actually found out it's got a name, Palabie Rock. And that was our playground, because it would, after rain, you'd get some pools in it, and there was one particular pool where the water would perhaps be there all over the winter time, and there'd be tadpoles and they'd turn into frogs and stuff. And I've often thought about it later. Where did those frogs go? I suspect they either dug into the ground, or there were some cracks in the granite. They might have disappeared into there, but we just took it for granted that there'd be these tadpoles and stuff.
And there were?
Oh yeah, there were. Lots of them. They might be a unique breed, I don't know. No idea.
Well, out there,
yeah.
It's pretty isolated. In fact, unique to that rock would be quite possible, I guess.
It could well be, well be. You have to wonder how they got there in the first place.
Yeah, well, the desert's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. We were within...
In fact, no wonder you sort of grew up to be a doctor. It's like the miracle of life was all around you. It was so harsh, and yet you had life appearing and sustaining itself.
And both of our parents, as I said, they'd explain what was happening and why it was happening and why you do it in a certain way and what to watch out for. It was just the way they were.
German, obviously. Klante.
Klante, that's probably a German name, and my mother was a Pech, Pech's actually Wendish, which is, the Wends are related more to the Russian type people, and her mother was German. But to my eyes now, the German part, the more German people, are a little bit stockier, a bit more my colouring. I had dark brown hair and brownish sort of eyes, whereas the Wendish ones are taller with longer, thinner faces, blue eyes, fair hair. So it was...
More the Scandinavians.
Yeah, it would be, more Scandinavian, Russian, that sort of...
Not such a surprise, because the Germans in South Australia were Prussian.
Yes, and so they intermarried quite a bit with them. Wendish language, I think, is mostly died out, but a couple of my cousins are quite interested in that, and there's still some old Wendish Bibles and stuff like that around. So
is that one of those languages that's not Indo-European?
It would be closer to Russian. That I don't know much about. Yeah.
Because there's a couple of there's Finnish and Estonian. They're related, but they're unique to themselves. They're not
related to any other language group.
Yeah, they don't have that root.
Yes.
You'd sort of imagine Welsh was a bit the same, but I believe that's not the case.
Is that so?
It's like, oh, where's the connection? But certainly they came out to Australia when about?
1850s.
1850s,
yeah.
As most of the Germans did.
Yes, they came out because there was land, and they initially settled in the Barossa.
Well, persecution of Lutherans was a bit of an issue at the time.
That was part of it, and a couple of the leading ministers often used to be people more related to their minister, their pastor, and they'd go where that pastor and family went.
Yep.
And that's,
well, Martin Luther, of course, being a great example of
the
charismatic leader sort of thing. Yep. And
the other thing, if you read histories of Harndorf and places like that, was they didn't come out as speculators. The first thing they came out was they'd start planting trees and everything, and they'd plant quick growing stuff like peas or whatever, and so within a few weeks they'd be pulling little onions out of their garden and stuff. They weren't speculating, they were there to stay.
Yes.
And they knew a lot of tricks, and I think the Barossa's probably quite a lot like where a lot of them came from, with the hills and some creeks and similar soils and stuff, because they had to get used to the summers. They had no idea what they were in for then. Yeah. Well,
they, of course, they had it easy compared to moving to the west coast. Do they talk about the contrast in moving from the Barossa to...
Mostly because there just aren't any. There are no, as you know, there's no creeks or anything, and it's all that limestoney sort of sandy stuff where you don't get that water. People would try and dig out. They called them dams. They'd scoop out these hollows, and I remember we tried to do one or two, but they seemed to leak. They obviously weren't sealed enough with clay or whatever. And so when they did the pipeline from the Todd pipeline, that was what really opened the land up, and the railway, the two things, major things.
Well, hence the pattern of settlement.
Very much so, following the railway, following the pipeline. And the roads were appalling. So people, if we went to visit, we had relatives living near Cummins, you'd get on the rail car and you'd travel on that. And I remember...
Which I believe really was a rail car. Or am I thinking of the supply train? But sorry, go on.
No, they called it a rail car. It wasn't quite like it was more like a tram. But more solid, more substantial sort of thing. And we had some relatives near Cummins, and at times go and stay with them because they'd be cousins or second cousins of similar ages, and so they'd put you on the rail car at one end and you'd travel for half a day or more and get met at the other end. And
yeah, terrific.
Oh, it was a great adventure.
And of course it's going to stay on the rails, so you know exactly where your kids are off to.
That's right, and you know that unless they've jumped off or done something stupid, they're going to arrive when the thing arrives. So that was nice, and we had... My dad's brother lived near us, so I had cousins that were there, and then some of Mum's relatives near Yolana, and they were a couple of big families, so there were cousins to stay with. And one family, the Modras, had a 2-storey house with stairs. Wow, that was amazing. And we kind of didn't know what to do with them. And those kids would be flying up and down the steps, and especially going down, we'd be shaking. But no, they were all good experiences.
Well, they would have been along that transport corridor, like you say, and also there's another line of settlements that goes up on the other spur that went up to Buckleboo.
Yes.
All those little settlements and football and netball clubs, and but they would imagine that, you know, people shuttling along on the rail car, you know, and all these to dances probably, and to weddings and meeting and marrying, and people like, you know, be related all down the line, I guess.
And also one source of income, and it was usually the women in the household that would be getting that, was from cream from the cows, because that was always women's work, milking the cows and separating off the cream and selling eggs, and those would go down to Port Lincoln, and there'd be a bit of cash coming back, because cash was not that common. And
in fact, you remember bartering?
A little bit.
Or just being self-sufficient more than anything?
Pretty well self-sufficient, but sometimes somebody would come, particularly people who could grow different kinds of fruit that we couldn't, or watermelons, because our water wasn't that flash, and so, you know, how about, look, we'll have some of that, how would you like a fresh killed side of lamb kind of thing, that sort of bartering, which everybody was happy with.
Yeah, that's right.
And for my mother, that was a source of income for her, because she kept quite a lot of fowls and turkeys even, and she would sell them to the local hotel. She had, and at one stage there was a restaurant, it's probably a bit fancy for it, but at the Wudinna railway station there was a place where you could buy meals, and they would buy eggs, and they would buy chooks, and they'd buy turkeys and stuff to feed the people. So that was pretty well where Mum got her most of her grocery type money, from those kinds of things.
Obviously, she would have made a lot of stuff like butter and whatnot on the...
Oh yes.
All that sort of thing on the farm.
Yes, you always had homemade butter, and you have people come to visit. Oh, you've got cream. You think, yeah, and
of course, when shipping it off down to Port Lincoln was unrefrigerated, I believe.
Oh, it didn't have refrigeration. No. And in the summertime, you know, the cream would be in these steel containers, and then you'd dip hessian, old wheat bags or something, dip them in the trough and put them over so the evaporation would keep them a little bit cooler. I don't know what it was like by the time it got put to Port Lincoln, but presumably it got turned into butter and whatever, who knows. And I don't think any of that was refrigerated either. It would have just rattled its way down on that narrow gauge.
No, I have read that it was not refrigerated,
No.
and that possibly some of the cream was a little bit haggy going by the time it reached on the really hot days.
Oh, look, it would be.
How many cows though? And of course, there's hardly any grass. How do you sustain cows? Because a lot of people had one, of course.
Yeah. We had, particularly when we went to Wudinna in 1949-50, we then had something like 24 cows, and we had a milking machine. I can't remember if it was there or if Dad bought it, but it was a milking machine. It would milk 2 cows at a time, so there was an arrangement for 4 cows. And so, you'd put them all in, and one would be hooked up to the milking machine. When she was done, you'd put it onto the other one and swap them around, and then he'd worked up a separator, the old separators, to get the cream off, but Dad had joined that up to put an extra belt on the engine somehow and onto the separator, so that was all part of what the milking machine did too as well. So
he was really quite progressive, was it?
Oh yeah, he was quite, I don't know if he thought of it himself or saw somebody else do it, but he'd think, look, why should somebody stand there turning a handle on a separator for ages when you could hook it up to the whole machinery and do it all at the one time?
Particularly when, there weren't enough hands, probably. Well, never enough hands.
No, and often that was, the women's work, that sort of thing, because the men would be out sort of trying to grow crops and plough the land and do stuff.
They'd be out there walking slowly around with the donkeys.
Well, they did have donkeys in the first place because the donkeys didn't need so much water.
Or food either, apparently.
No, they live on stuff that horses can't live on.
Yeah, because horses are really quite fussy, aren't they?
Can be, yeah.
Yeah. And you got to feed them for one thing.
Now, when the family were first at Warramboo, Dad was probably in his late teens.
Yep.
And that was his job, water carting with his team of donkeys, and he had a wagon and it had a couple of big square cast iron sort of tanks on the back, and there was the Todd pipeline must have already come up because they had side pipelines, and then they'd put up what they called standpipes. So it was like something that was about head height or a bit higher, so you could put a tank or a wagon or something in underneath it and fill the tank and then take it back. It didn't mean you had enough water to necessarily irrigate anything, but at least keep your stock alive.
Yeah.
I think of the pipeline from Port Lincoln, and of course that's been enlarged and whatever, and then the other pipeline that has come up across the Gulf and gone to Whyalla and places like, and to Kimber, places like that.
But you don't remember ever a time when you couldn't turn the tap on, though?
No, I don't. That's right. There was always a tap in the garden that you could turn on, and there was always the precious rainwater that was for house use, or a few special plants that couldn't cope with the minerally water.
Yeah, and there would have been snakes in the dunny, of course.
Never actually saw one, but
redbacks, of course.
Redbacks, sleepy lizards.
Oh yeah.
But allegedly, my younger brother Barry went in one day and there was a snake in there, and apparently he did a standing jump from the top of the seat out the door.
As you would.
Well, definitely.
Because you have the impressive snakes.
Well, the brown snakes, which are quite deadly actually. Death adders, which we didn't see much of, because they hide themselves more, and probably while I was growing up, they weren't as common as they had been. And occasionally a non-venomous, what were they called? Something a bit like a boa constrictor, but not as...
some sort of a python sort of thing.
Python, that's right. And they had often quite a pretty sort of patterned skin.
Carpet python? Or?
Carpet snake, they called them. Yeah, quite right.
Yeah. What other wildlife was around your area? The birds, of course. You used to go and collecting eggs and that sort of stuff? Or?
Yeah. We didn't go birds nesting as such. We sort of thought, well, we'll let them do their own stuff. But Mum always had chooks, and so you'd set up nesting boxes for them and places for them to lay, and of course you'd have some that would find their own spots, and particularly if they sort of went broody and sat on a lot, but you'd try and find them and then put them in some place safe so the chickens could hatch and they could look after them.
Was that helpful later on to doctoring, that you'd grown up on a farm with all that?
Very much so.
You're certainly familiar with birth and all the rest of it?
Very much so, and because both of our parents were natural teachers, they'd explain not only what they were doing it, but why they were doing it, and why they were doing it in a certain way.
And while they were doing it?
Yeah, you'd be watching it all. Look, no, you'd never hold a knife like this, you hold it like so. And when you're going in here, look, this is, and Dad particularly, or Mum, would name what the parts were, and particularly watch out for the gallbladder. You didn't want to puncture that, because if it leaked over everything, that just spoilt it. You couldn't use that for anything. So there was sort of quite a few tricks of that.
And that's a massive advantage, like having an introduction to anatomy.
And also, I think my dad was probably better than most people at doing all those kinds of things. He'd seem to, be able to get the skin all coming off neatly in one bit. And as a shearer, he was a very good shearer. You've got to have the animal feeling comfortable enough, or it struggles and kicks and stuff. But a good shearer, it just flows.
A good butcher too.
Oh, very much so. And we did a lot of spotlighting. Go out on the back of the truck. And for some reason my brother preferred using the rifle and I preferred using the spotlight. I'm pretty good with the spotlight. And so you'd go out and particularly in the early 50s, rabbits absolutely everywhere. And foxes, and particularly the foxes that came near the house, because they always had designs on the chooks. So rabbits and foxes and kangaroos. All the kangaroos would come in, knock the crop down, and kangaroos are good to eat too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, that which brings us to your mother's cooking. What did she cook?
Well, we were never short of meat, so there was always... She had a big wood oven, as you'd imagine. And so there'd always be something like a shoulder of lamb or a leg of lamb or something like that. Kangaroo, we'd eat the tails, and again Mum would sort of braise them in the oven in a covered dish, like people do oxtail, I think. Being one of the favourite things we liked. And with a wood stove, she could make it real hot if you wanted scones and something quick. If you were doing a fruit cake, something that had to be a certain temperature for a long, steady time, or something like a roast, which is pretty forgiving. We'd take it for granted. You'd often head off to church on a Sunday if there was something happening, so you sort of go to church and the service would probably be at, 10 or 11 or something like that, and then by the time you got home it'd be at 1 o'clock and you'd be starving, and Mum would pull out a hot dinner.
Well, I believe that's where the tradition of the Sunday roast would have come from, probably.
Yeah.
You need something to leave on while you're at church.
Well, exactly. And people sort of develop an appetite with all of that.
Yeah, and quite possibly got company as well. So.
Yeah.
In fact, there was no actual, I believe, there was no actual Lutheran church until the 50s or something.
There were...
House church before that.
trying to think. I think there would have been churches at Port Lincoln or Cummins, places like that earlier. There was certainly one at Cleve. There was a minister from Cleve who'd come over to do services. And then Warramboo was part of a parish. You know, the Lutheran Church, there was two Lutheran churches. The United Evangelical and the Evangelical. They used the same hymn book, but I don't know. I think there were too many chiefs and not enough seats for them and stuff. Anyway, they eventually got their act together in 1966.
The Lutherans are famous for that, but
no,
because they take their religion seriously.
No pig-headed people there. One of the big differences, crazy thing, was in Revelation there's something about there'll be 1,000 years before Christ returns. And the argument was, is this a literal 1,000 years or is this a figure of speech? And that was one of the major things.
Yeah.
The other thing was there were too many chiefs and not enough places for them, I think.
Well, that's where you look at a place in the Barossa like Lights Pass.
Oh yes, yeah, with the churches, crazy.
I think they have 6 or something.
Yeah, they use the same hymn books. They use the same liturgy.
Yeah. But they have one little difference of opinion, and they.
But I'm pleased to say my family were more broad-headed than that. I was baptised in one church and confirmed in the other because that's where we happened to be.
Is that right? There you go. A bit more, they were quite
and it was
broad-minded, your folks, then.
Yeah. And same hymn book, same Bible, same... The guys wore the same gear, you know. They'd always... the pastor would be in the black with the little white doohickeys and things. And yeah.
Was any German spoke around the house?
Only if they didn't want us to know certain things.
So they spoke German, they would...
Yeah, Mum's family had... Yeah, and Dad's family too. They'd learnt German as children and they'd learnt English at the same time, so they were fluent in both. Yeah. My grandmother was a good ecumenical person. They lived in the Barossa, and when my dad and his brother were growing up, they had a raft of cousins, second cousins, and some of them had married Catholics and some weren't. So my grandmother, look, you kids need to know your catechism, your 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer and stuff, and the Catholics, they had their rosary, which includes those, so she'd teach both impartially according to whatever it was, and more important that they had a bit of knowledge of Christianity than be totally little heathens. Well,
that's what it's really, in fact, really, if you look at the messages, what every mother tells every kid, basically. The 10 Commandments, really.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. And then of course, the different denominations is just getting down to the fine print.
but pretty well every denomination, every Christian denomination, the common thing is the commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer. They're the 3 major things, and the rest of it's optional.
Well, so I say the rest of it's the fine print.
It's decoration, whatever.
Yeah, that's right. But of course, the over time, just briefly before we come back to your life, but the arguments that they used to have between, and of course it was mostly political because of who was in charge and what.
Too many chiefs and not enough Indians.
Well, but the arguments between Constantinople and Rome, of course.
That was a power struggle too. It wasn't theological; it was a power struggle.
Yeah, and it was only when the Byzantines crumbled to not enough that they suddenly decided that maybe we weren't quite so stuck on some of that dogma actually. So I can't remember what the very fine points were, but I think it was on defining the Trinity or something like that. It was very
nothing that would affect your day to day.
No, how are you going to live your life? No, but it made difference to some people. But then so you're at Warramboo and then you're at Wudinna.
Yes.
Up until you finished school, and then you had to come to Adelaide to finish your school, or you were able to do that.
At that stage, the area school only went to year 10 to do.
Then you got your scholarship.
And then got a Commonwealth scholarship, which they were handing out plenty of them in those days, and they gave a boarding allowance also to kids from the country. So then I was able to come to Concordia, just down the road here, to do leaving and leaving honours year 11 and 12. And then I got a Commonwealth scholarship, another one that paid university fees plus a boarding allowance, which again was brilliant. So then I was able to go to university and study medicine and become a doctor. So.
And you did?
Yep.
It obviously wasn't quite that simple. There was 6 years of fairly hard graft in the meantime, but you did all those advantages as a farm girl. Yeah, so you studied at what, Adelaide Uni? Or?
Yeah.
Yep. 6 years is a big part of your life. Did you do anything apart from study during those 6 years?
What do you think?
No.
Well, it was interesting because first year was just essentially a science course.
Yes.
And the hardest part in that was sort of the physics and chemistry. I mean, we'd done some, but it could have been better. But when it got to anatomy and physiology and stuff, you know, you'd think some people would be looking at, you know, the real body lying there, and you think they'd sort of open it up and what's that? Oh, that's its liver, and that's its big bowel, and that's its little bowel, and that's its spleen, and the kidneys are hiding back there. How the hell do you know that? Well, that's where they are in the sheep. Why are people that different, you know? And get you some funny looks, but anyway.
I believe that even genetically there's not actually much difference.
No, probably not. No. No. So, yeah, so thanks to the scholarships, that was great.
What was Adelaide like then? Of course, you were coming from somewhere very different to live in the big smoke.
Yeah. Going to Concordia, which is just down the road here, as you know, and at that stage it was pretty well totally a boarding school, enrolment of a bit over 200. And there would have been close to 100 girls in a hostel on Wattle Street, a big building still there, and 100 lads on the campus at Concordia, which is still where it was. I thought it was rather unfair that it was the boys that could stay there and have their hot lunch there and then go and play, whereas we'd spent half of our lunch hour simply walking back to the hostel.
It was unfair, Joy. It was unfair.
Of course it was. But we got very fit. It was all right. But I made, you know, you meet people from all over Australia at that stage. A lot of people from Victoria in particular. One or two from Western Australia, a couple from New South Wales. Although there were Lutheran colleges.
Probably because they weren't then. They had to come all the way to Adelaide then, because obviously the Lutheran community would have been bigger here. But
yeah, but there were other Lutheran colleges, and of course the Lutheran church was two Lutheran churches, and so did you go to... It was interesting, I was baptised in the so-called ULCA, one half of the Lutheran church, and then the family moved to Wudinna, and parents said it's stupid driving all that way back to Warramboo when we could go and join a congregation at Yanani that's actually got a resident pastor. So I baptised in one and confirmed in the other. So I'm a fair income. When the churches joined, I said about time.
When did they join?
66. Yeah. Oh, they had to do it right.
Yeah, well, being Germans.
Thoroughly.
Yeah, that's right.
I personally think that perhaps one or two people had to die to free things up a bit, but
very much.
That might not be fair or true.
Oh well, you might be fair and close to the mark sort of thing. A lot of stuff like that. Of course, the only reason that we've still got newspapers is because Rupert's still around. Yeah. They won't outlive him, but sorry.
Yeah, we had.
Sorry, they'll only just outlive him. So.
Yeah. We probably learnt more about some of the ins and outs of Lutheran Church in that two of Mum's brothers are ministers, pastors, and one went to Central Australia, was a missionary there for a while. One went to Papua New Guinea and spent pretty well all his life there, and he finished up being principal of a teachers' college there.
In Port Moresby? Or?
Yeah. Mum's younger, the one who went to Central Australia, he took 6 weeks to learn enough Pitjantjatjara to do a sermon in Aranda, to preach in Aranda. He was very good at languages. I mean, Lutheran ministers at that stage had to do Latin, German, Greek and Hebrew. So they had a lot of in-depth language training.
Extraordinary, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was sort of always part of our lives, and we'd get letters from these people who were in Central Australia or Papua New Guinea. It could have been from Mars as far as we knew.
Particularly in the days before travel.
Yeah, and they would only come on, they called it furlough holidays. Initially it was only once every 7 years, which is an awfully long time. Seemed like an awfully long time, and you just sort of get to know that batch of cousins. They'd have several months off in total, but by the time they'd done the rounds, and because, you know, living at Wudinna, they'd come and stay for at least a week to make it worth the trip.
So it would have been a fun week.
Oh, very much so.
Seeing another 7 years.
Yeah, yeah.
When did the pool come to Wudinna? When did they build the pool at Wudinna?
There was already a pool there when I started school, but it was a little one, and it just had tod water in it, and it was foul. If you swallowed that, it was just about make you sick. It was horrible. And then it would have been late 50s, early 60s, thereabouts, when the whole pool complex was redone and the pool was made a whole lot bigger. But by then they had the second pipeline coming up with the water from, what's the name of the springs? Anyway, much, much better water, much less minerally. And it meant that people could grow a whole lot of things that previously you could only grow with rainwater. Some things will tolerate a fair bit of minerals and salt and stuff, and others definitely won't.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, that's right. We had a bore when I was a kid that was too minerally. We couldn't really use it for that.
Yeah. And so, you know, things like mulching gardens and stuff, that was just what you did. You sort of put a good layer of whatever, and, you know, you'd cart down a load from the chook shed or from the cow yard or something and sort of dig it in more or less and put some straw on top of it, and things would grow like.
Well, that's right. Of course, you in all those books, it's like, you know, the latest thing sort of stuff. Well, it's old. It's old knowledge, isn't it?
It all comes around. Yeah.
When did your family's farming go mechanical? When did they get rid of the donkeys and the horse team?
The horse team earlier. The donkeys they had because donkeys don't need so much water. And my father, he would have been in his late teens, early 20s, whatever. Carting water was half a day's work pretty well every day for him. Actually wasted, well, not a waste, but a big swatch of time and energy. So first of all, then when the pipeline came up, not every farm had water to them, but what they did was we called them standpipes. There'd be water that came off, and then people could go somewhere within probably half an hour to an hour's trip from their farm and load up a load of water, but then you could spend half your summer just carting water. So having reticulated water was a big thing. And then that also meant in summertime, that was one of your major preoccupations. And then, when was it? When did poly pipes come in? 60s, I suppose. Polyester piping made a huge difference because the old galvanised piping, poly pipes, anybody can fix them, but the galvanised stuff, you had to know what you were doing and be able to join and solder and goodness knows what to mend them. So it meant that it was possible to have a lot more stock and generally look after them. Yep,
which they did. I remember we had irrigation pipes that were made of metal. Mind you, I think they're fairly common, but carry those around. But yeah, if they got a hole in them, it was
that was that.
That was that really, for, as far as we're concerned, because we only had a hobby farm, so it was like we didn't know how to fix anything.
Mm.
Yeah.
As when I was a bit older, when my brother left school, he'd finished year 10, and he was what, 14 and a half, and he was bright enough he could have gone. No, he said, I just want to be a farmer. So once when he was home, he'd always be on a tractor or something. So I'd be the one that went out with my father to open and shut gates and fix pipes and dig stuff and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Makes me laugh a bit. Years later, when I was a medical student, I had a friend and she invited me up to her home up in the hills, and she had a couple of other friends. Oh, we'll go out to so-and-so's place and they've got a farm, and you sort of meet these other couple of not bad lads. Mm. And I happened to be sitting in the front, and you pull up at some gate and they say, oh, front seat passenger opens the gate. It was one of those,
Mm-hmm.
So I get out and I open the gate. They nearly fell over. Mm-hmm. But you're doing medicine. How do you know to do that? I said, I've been doing it since I was so high. Mm. That was good.
Mm-hmm.
And
a lot of roads used to be gated, even.
Yes, even the highways were. There were gates across the highways. Yep.
Yep. Hence the signs that started springing up, close the bloody gate.
Unforgivable sin. Rule number 1, leave the gate as you find it.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Because of course, when did they take away the gates on the roads?
Oh.
60s?
Yeah, it would have been. Trying to remember. There weren't gates anymore, but those cattle grids, of course.
Yeah, and then they replaced them with
They replaced the gates, yeah.
Have you got the photographs of your parents?
Oh, have I? Got to stop and think. This is more recent.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to take the camera around here then, so you can turn it around. No, that's cool, you do that. I'm just going to change the...
Yeah, I should have some...
Maybe even put another camera up for when you do that, actually.
Ah.
Yeah, that's got it. Okay, sorry, yep. Oh, I'll tell you what, you've got a beautiful shot there. That must have been taken by the professional photographer. That black and white one.
This one?
There.
Yep, that quite possibly was, yeah.
Looks like it.
Well, there's a couple. My parents' dad actually in a suit with a tie, which was a rare thing. Mm-hmm. And my mother. This medical class was probably the biggest one that started, because in first year there were close to 200 of us. And of course the mortality rate in first year is about 50%, because a lot of people hadn't even done year 12.
Really?
You could get in if you had passed your leaving. You didn't have to have done year 12. A lot of the people who repeated then went on to complete the medical course, but close to half of the first year courses at the start of the 60s repeated first year, because it was very different, I think. I didn't do year 12 chemistry because, I don't know, the teacher left or something, so that was a big hole that I sort of had to fill, but the rest of it was all right.
Yep. And so then you got married in '67, so in fact...
halfway through my intern year.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rob's was a year ahead of me.
Yep. And he was doing...
He's in medicine, he's a year ahead of me. Mm-hmm. But we were working on the same unit at the Royal Adelaide under a fairly crusty surgeon who...
who amused you? Well, both in hindsight, maybe more than at the time.
No, he'd have little tantrums and tell off the staff or tell off his residents or whatever. But I remember him having a go at Rob one day, quite unfairly, and Rob just didn't. He just stayed calm. He just let him blow his stack and just went quietly on with what he was doing.
You were quite impressed by that?
I'm quite impressed by the whole package. Still am.
Fantastic. Yeah. So go on then. You first met at, obviously, university.
Yes, Rob was in a year ahead of me, and I remember, especially in second year where you start to do anatomy, you're in the same room as the third years. Mm-hmm. And I rather fancied one of his friends, actually. Mm-hmm. Quite a nice sort of chap, but I sort of knew who Rob was. But then it was when we worked together in my final year. There weren't that many students in his year, so once they thought we weren't a menace to society, they said, look, you'll only get half pay, but you can come and work in the hospital. And we weren't allowed to write death certificates or work certificates, the legal things, because we weren't fully qualified. Yes. But we did everything else.
Really?
Yeah, and you know, when you've worked with somebody and neither of you have had any sleep for 36 hours or something, you know what they're like.
Really would.
And one of the guys we worked for had a bit of a trigger temper, and sometimes he'd, you know, just really do his rag, and quite unfairly at times, and some people would react and Rob would just let it go through to the keeper and just get on with his work.
Where's he from?
Parents lived up at St George's, grew up in Adelaide, went to Unley High.
So he's not a laconic country boy, he's just a laconic city boy. Yeah. So you're all very impressed by that, and you first...
What have we got there? That's my parents, so it would be our wedding day. This is, guess what, on a honeymoon, of course. Look at the goofy faces.
That's a magnificent photograph too. Who took it?
Which one?
Honeymoon one.
Probably on whatever the thing was we were on. One of these people that went around.
Stradbroke Island cruise. Well, because that's a pretty professional photograph too, I think.
Yeah, it probably is.
Yeah.
But we quite liked it.
Yeah, and that's and that of course would have been the time to go to Stradbroke Island too, of course.
Yeah, quite a bit. Well, what else have we got there? Oh, a few other. Yeah.
So the music hall restaurant, and they obviously had a photographer on hand too.
Yes, they had a photographer on hand.
Yeah, looks like they did. A nice frame there. Whereabouts was it? The music hall restaurant. Oh, this is in Queensland too, is it?
No. That's here in Adelaide. Yeah. That was. Can't remember. I don't know. Oh, hello, these have all got... Oh, damn it, they stick together, some of these. Yeah, Rob was in St John Ambulance as well. He drove ambulances and stuff.
Because he wasn't busy enough?
Oh, helping get through his student days.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Yeah, oh, different.
He's in cadets as well. So you both worked in Adelaide?
Yeah.
At the Royal Adelaide?
At the Royal Adelaide.
Yeah.
And...
from the late 60s, I guess? If you graduated 67, I guess you started work immediately, 68? Or?
No, I finished... I was 6 years, so 67 was my first intern year, and Rob was a year ahead of me. Yeah. So he was a senior RMO and I was one. And then we worked at the Children's.
Yes.
Oh, golly, this is...
So you're both at the Children's?
Yes.
So working together, which is...
Rob was a registrar and I was a resident. We didn't... Gosh, this has really gotten...
Did you have the same hours, or...? Because that's one of the tricky things with that sort of job.
I think we'd be home together maybe 2 nights a week. Or you'd be on call.
Ships in the night.
Children wasn't so bad because if you're on call overnight, you usually got some sleep, but at the RA you were lucky if you got an hour. And you still do your next day's work.
What is the rationale behind working doctors to a state of exhaustion and keeping them like that?
Possibly that there's not enough to keep your rosters over, but it also teaches you a bit how to pace yourself and how to. And I'm lucky because I can take a cat nap any time I want to. It reminds me a bit of in my final year. There weren't that many students in Rob's year, and my year had loads of them. So people that they thought would be safe to let loose in the hospital were told, look, you can how about, would you like to work as a resident medical officer? You'll only get half the pay and you're not allowed to sign death certificates or work certificates. But would you? Well, of course, I jumped at it. You know, a bit of work. So that's where I met Rob. But we're doing the same amount of work, and amazing how little sleep you can get on. So, yeah.
Sorry, who have we got here?
Who have we got? That's some of the time we were.
Whereabouts?
This one was in Canada. This one was visiting friends in Denver and having a barbecue, and they took us up to the top. You can see the snow on the ground, but it wasn't all that cold. Camping. We had 2 kids then.
You're obviously working in Canada.
Yes, Rob was. I didn't. I worked in England when we spent a year in Bristol. But
what was he doing in Canada?
Same thing, looking after newborn babies. And what have we got? There's probably a ventilator somewhere in the background. Learning to keep alive babies that weigh 700 grams or something. Tiny little scraps.
And you were doing the same thing?
No, I was doing general paediatrics.
But Rob would have been certainly...
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, he's 6'3" and he was rowed for the university and sort of keen on these tiny little scary babies.
Yeah, no, it would have been...
Yeah, we visited friends here
incredibly
in Denver.
Complex
Look.
And tiny little things.
And just learning how to keep them alive, learning how to keep them on ventilators for a while, how to feed them. This thing, I fed it and then it bit my finger.
It's a
prairie dog. Yeah, you can see a bit of burrows and stuff. Yeah. Some of this is our 3 boys when they were little. What else have we got? That's the kids. That's my dad with our youngest son. That's quite a nice picture because he was always camera conscious, so it's very hard to get a decent picture of him.
The airplane something to do with the family?
That might have been... Ross here, yeah, Rob got a private pilot's licence, so we actually flew over to Wudinna a couple of times. It meant people had to meet you there. Yep. And then a friend of ours who's a farmer, who married one of my good friends, said, forget about that, why don't you learn to fly something that doesn't have all that noise in front of it, because he's a glider pilot. So Rob got hooked on that. And then he'd go to Waikerie and he'd fly the tug at Waikerie and earn enough credit, and then he'd go up for a week to fly the gliders. Really... That was a real good thing for him because it was so different. Yes.
I learned to fly a glider when I was young. It's magnificent.
Did you? Yeah. Yeah, I've been up in a twin with somebody and...
I haven't flown solo, but it was a magnificent feeling. It was so much more like flying than being in an aeroplane.
So much quieter.
Well, so much quieter for one thing, but it actually felt like you were flying.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as the glider pilots will tell you, it's heaps safer, no engine.
Well, as Rob said, it gave you, if the noise at the front stops, you can still get it down in one piece.
Well, that's true too, yeah.
What have we got here? That's my mum's family, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, one of them's missing. 2, anyway. But, yeah. Teachers, ministers, farmers, God knows what. Yeah, Rob.
All Germans, I guess. In fact, it's amazing just how many Germans on the expedition.
Yeah, some of
and it's also how many Greeks. Because the Poles and the Norths are Greek.
That's right. Yeah. I only realised that later on.
In fact, the original brothers who came over from Greece, they did a lot of the clearing on the peninsula. Because reading the Kind Cutter book, right. Obviously there was the Norse, and I'm pretty sure that the Poles were actually in that area in the early days, opening up. And they were also opened up a lot of the country around Warminda, because they're in the Warminda book. Okay.
Yeah, my grandfather would talk about some of the Greeks who'd been literally chopping down the trees.
Yeah, well, that was the Pauls and the Norths, the two lots of brothers, I gather. And they did, and they of course would, for a year or so at a time, or 6 months, would go and live with the lads who were opening up the country before the family.
Before the family moved in. Well, you'd have to build somewhere to put your wife and hopefully kids and whatever.
That's right. So you'd get the Pauls or the Norths in to sort of help you get a start, and then they would move on to the next one when your wife and kids turned up.
Once you could get on with something.
That's right. And famously, of course, then have to clean up the living arrangements because a bunch of blokes had been living there, which is something that John Katersky was talking about.
Well, yeah, men's idea of housework is somewhat different, yeah.
But you had some sort of knowledge of or link with the Katerskis?
We knew them from church because we worshipped at the same church at Yanani, and I think when Dad and his brother were shearing, I think he'd shorn at Katerskis at different times. When he was, that's how he met my mother. She was at, think of the place, near Streaky Bay. Family had a heap of kids, and as it was in those times, if you had someone sort of young woman, often they'd go and help the woman look after their tribe of kids that were usually spaced about 2 years apart, and she had the 7th or 8th. And my dad happened to be shearing up there with his brother, and they had some sort of night where they were all, together and just spending a night together, and he made some remark to my mother and she slapped him across the face, and things progressed from there.
Yeah, well, it certainly does stick in the mind.
Yeah.
And earns a certain amount of respect probably too.
This is another picture of my parents with a very good friend. He's died since then.
If we can leave it flat, that would be
Sorry,
No, that's right. No, you're right.
Oldest brother and his family, these are getting a bit old.
Oh, here's a good photo.
That's friends. One of my very good friends, I shared a room with her for a year. He's a farmer. He's the only farmer I know that would go and milk his cows in the morning to the tune of Bach. He loved Bach, and he has a brilliant stereo system. So he'd set it all up, and so he'd be going out there, feeding the pigs and looking after the chooks and milking the cows.
Carter in fugue.
Yeah, exactly. And he still is. He got Rob into gliding because Terry's a glider. He might have a power licence, I don't know, but he said to Rob, forget the noise up the front, learn to fly properly.
He did, fantastic, loved it.
We've got different friends, kids. This is mostly, it's my older brother and a couple of his kids. My boys when they were young and innocent looking, my parents' ruby wedding.
And this must be Monash.
Monash, yeah.
Because I remember that well while it lasted.
Great fun, yes.
Oh, Monash was the best program ever.
Oh, it was terrific, yeah.
Ever.
Yeah. This is my parents' initial...
it was so brilliantly counterbalanced.
Yeah, and it had the right sort of movement that a giraffe has.
That's right, it actually looked like... Isn't that incredible? You're right.
Yeah. We were lucky enough to do a trip to South Africa a couple of years ago and see some of these beasties in life, which was good.
That too well, we'll see. You there,
this is Rob's grandfather, lived up there. This is Rob's mum and brother, but the grandfather he had trotters, and he used to sit in the sulky and drive them and stuff, and sometimes his tactics weren't the ones that the stewards liked, apparently.
Necessity is the mother of...
a lot of invention, yes.
In fact, one of the interesting things about that area is that's where Landcare started.
Ah, yeah. Because if you don't look after the land, it's virtually a fossil. It's not quite a fossilised, is it? You know, you've got the sand ridges and the clay flats, and if you don't look after it, the ridges drift and the flats don't do all that well. You grew up in that sort of area, you know.
Which is exactly right. I mean, if you don't look after it, it blows away blows off over into the neighbour's
into the neighbour's fence and buries their fences and makes a darn nuisance of itself.
But it's an extraordinary little area, and of course that's where that interesting chap Bedford.
I was thinking of Bedford and his museum. Now I wonder what's happened to all that stuff.
I was wondering what has happened to all that stuff.
Bill Bedford, old man Bedford's son, he used to fly the mail to, what's the island out from Venus Bay somewhere, and so he'd fly more or less over our farm. And once or twice he sort of landed in a paddock nearby, and sometimes, you know, if he'd had a good day, he'd sort of fly over and he'd drop a packet of garfish or flounder or something on the roof. But the farm happened to be on his flight path.
Yeah, that was, he was from, old man Bedford was from Cambridge or somewhere like that.
Must have been, and I remember
academic
going to that little museum, whatever he had, and there was a real mummy there, and there was all sorts of things. Amazing collection of stuff that he had, and
apparently one of the world's foremost collections of a certain type of mineral.
Yeah, what was it? I'll probably come back.
I'm not sure myself, but he was there in Calcutta because it came all the way there because he knew that was an interesting little spot for whatever he was researching, which I think he might have been looking at the skies from there, but I think he was interested in all sorts, wasn't he?
Oh, he was. I don't know about, maybe not the geology.
I think he delivered a lot of babies actually.
Well,
which is, you know, quite a handy skill out in that area, as well as flying people to hospital. I believe that he delivered a lot.
Yeah, he did quite a lot of that.
Yeah, sort of a bush doctor.
They did have like a maternity thing there very early. Then when the Wudinna Hospital was built, well, that's where I was born.
But before that, yeah, I believe it was better take him over to the Bedfords then, at Calcutta.
There probably were one or two other people who were reasonable sort of midwives who probably learnt on the job.
But interesting how Calcutta was the maternity centre of Central Air Peninsula.
And it's interesting that Wudinna then became the main town rather than Calcutta, which is the intersection. But I wonder if that's because Calcutta was such a stony place, whereas Wudinna was much easier to build a town. But of course, when the area school got there, that made it go. That's why our parents moved to be closer to that.
So did Calcutta have more buildings at one stage?
Don't know.
More shops maybe, or?
No. Don't remember that. The farm where my first memories are, that was south of Warramboo, in from the siding of Nantuma. So all those interesting little names that they had there. And the church that we used to worship in at Warramboo was shifted lock, stock and barrel, and it's now the Lutheran Church in Wudinna.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's made of tin? Or?
Yeah.
Well, Warramboo would have had more people at some stage.
Oh, they did, because most of the families had 8 or 10 kids, didn't they?
That's right. Yeah. And simply it was, well, dropping, in fact, as far as the farms got bigger, in fact, the falling birth rate is really significant. Going to 2 kids from 8 or 9 is significant.
Yeah. But also the advances in machinery and so on.
Yeah, big time. Because
you didn't need that much physical labour. You would get machinery that would do the job of 4, 6, 8 people, and a lot less fuss.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you know, obviously the cotton gin had a big part in the American Civil War, of course. Yeah, that's just the way it goes with technology. Anyway, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much.
All right.